There has been a proposal on the table for decades now. Declare the Middle East a nuclear weapons-free zone, like Latin America, South Pacific, Africa. That's an option. Iran has agreed to that option. There's one holdout, one outlier, Israel. So you had the option of turning the Middle East into a nuclear weapon-free zone, and we wouldn't be having any of these discussions.
American political scientist and activist Professor Norman Finkelstein giving, as ever, his very direct perspective on the issues behind Israel's conflicts with its Middle Eastern neighbors. Hello and welcome, I'm Riz Khan. In the 13 months since I last spoke with him, the regional clashes have reached new levels, most recently with Iran and Israel trading missiles. I caught up with Professor Finkelstein at his home for a very candid conversation on where he sees things heading. Professor, it's really good to see you face to face. We've done a number of interviews remotely over the years, but it's good to sit with you face to face and have a chance to talk about what's going on. Now, since we last spoke about a year ago, things have changed quite dramatically, progressively worse, a lot of people would say. Now, let me start with just one of the more recent things. Donald Trump, as president of the USA, talking about Iran and Israel being in a conflict for so long, they don't even know what the F they're doing. It's unusual for a president to use the F word. What did you make of that when he described it that way?
Well, I think both sides know exactly what they're doing. I don't think there is any misapprehension. Israel has regarded Iran as a major regional rival for a very long time.
Rival or threat?
Rival for a very long time. They've always said that their chief, they call it the main threat to Israel. To Israel, they used to say Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran. Now, you will recall already during the build-up to the war in Iraq, there is a certain misapprehension. I'm referring now to 2003. Israel's first goal was not Iraq. Israel wanted to attack Iran. The United States had set its sights on Iraq. And the view back then, now we're talking about 20 years ago, the view back then was first Iraq, then Syria, then Iran. So it's been a very consistent policy.
Quite strategic the way you're describing it, yeah.
It's been a strategic goal. What changed was there's obviously a difference between an objective and the opportunity to achieve the objective. Now, when October 7th happened, Israel set as its first objective to, for once and for all, solve the Gaza question. There weren't going to be any more mowings of the lawn, as Israel called it. The Operation Cast Lead, Operation, that was 2008-9, Operation Pillar of Defense, 2012, Operation Protective Edge, 2014. There weren't going to be any more operations. We are going to solve the Gaza question once and for all. And the final solution to the Gaza question, it basically took three forms. One, ethnic cleansing. Two, make Gaza unlivable. And three, carry out a mass extermination. And those goals, they overlapped with each other. So at the beginning, it was ethnic cleansing. They hoped to push the whole population into the Sinai, but that the Arab states vetoed that. Then began the making Gaza unlivable with a mass extermination occurring simultaneously. Then Israel realized it could achieve other objectives. In the course of the Israeli genocide in Gaza, they realized they could disable Hezbollah. And that was always a strategic objective of Israel. And they achieved that goal, it seems. I'm not convinced it's been as devastating a blow to Hezbollah as has been claimed, but they obviously did some significant damage. And then they realized they could achieve their third goal, and that was Iran. So what did change was, even though this had been a strategic objective of Israel, they realized after October 7th, they maybe could achieve that goal.
You know, you have Benjamin Netanyahu in power for so long and seeming to ride every challenge against him. His claim has been for years that Iran is very close to achieving a nuclear weapon. I mean, that's been going on for quite a while, that narrative. How have you regarded the evidence versus the claims?
I'm not an expert in those fields. I can only quote what everybody else has said. Tulsi Gabbard, who's responsible for national intelligence, she said the evidence said no. The IAEA belatedly, the IAEA stated, the head of the IAEA stated that there was no concerted effort on Iran's side to create a nuclear weapon. So, based on the available evidence, the answer seems to be there isn't evidence. I would say, my opinion, Iran would be foolish not to acquire a nuclear weapon. So you have to assume that if that's my rational judgment, it's probably the rational judgment of many people in Iran as well. There are two possibilities. Possibility number, okay, let me just backtrack a bit. There are claims that Iran has been in violation of aspects of the inspections. I read the IAE report. I probably have it right over here, as a matter of fact.
Not to worry, we
Yeah,
can refer to it. Yeah.
I read the IAE report, and I think a reasonable conclusion is that the IAE inspectors are being truthful, and I don't have any reason to doubt their truthfulness, though I don't like what the head of the IAEA did. He released the report, gave Israel and the US the pretext to attack, and then belatedly, after the attack, declared that there's no evidence that Iran is embarked on the program to create nuclear weapons. That could easily have been in the report. So when Iran says the IAEA was complicit in the attack or facilitated it, I think that's correct. In any event, it seemed plausible that Iran had carried on some enrichment that wasn't revealed to the IAEA, or they tried to conceal it from the IAEA, that the expression is sanitized, which basically means destroyed some evidence. Yeah, I think those things are all plausible. However, having said that, we have to be clear about basic facts. First of all, everybody is in violation of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Everybody likes to quote the part that non-nuclear powers who are signatories to the treaty aren't allowed to build nuclear weapons. They're allowed to use nuclear power for peaceful purposes. But there's another part to the treaty which everybody seems to forget. Article 6 says that the nuclear powers have to get rid of the weapons. They have to negotiate in good faith to eliminate the weapons. Now, most people will yawn, well, that's not really possible. I'm sorry. That's in the treaty, Article 6. In 1996, there was a major international court of justice advisory opinion. The question was, is the threat or use of nuclear weapons legal under international law? I won't go through the specifics, but I will go to the very end where the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, says there has to be good faith negotiations to eliminate nuclear weapons. Now, the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, was signed in 1968. We're in 2025. I think that's a long time. And if those weapons have not been eliminated, when I say those weapons, I mean by the US, the UK, France, the Soviet Russia, and China. I don't think Pakistan and India are signatories to the NPT. But those five, they were obliged. So they're in breach of the treaty. Who are they to lecture Iran about being in breach of the NPT when they're in breach of the NPT? That's the first point. The second point is, I'm just going to give you a historical, not so much analogy coming before it. Since somebody mentioned that on my screen, there's Professor Chomsky on my computer screen, I'll tell you a small anecdote, okay? You're much too young to remember, but after World War II, there was a very famous case in the United States of two people named Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, and another person, Morton Sobel. They were accused of giving atomic bomb secrets to the Russians, okay? That they had stolen information from Los Alamos, where the atomic bomb was made, and transferred it to the Russians, or the Soviets at the time. And it was a big cause of the left, because Ethel and Julius Rosenberg had been in the Communist Party, and they left already, but they had been in it, and it became a big case. The Rosenbergs, save the Rosenbergs. The Rosenbergs were eventually executed. Now, everybody on the left believed the Rosenbergs were innocent. And Professor Chomsky is a person of the left. And we had many conversations about the subject. And he said, I think they were guilty, the Rosenbergs. It turned out he was half right and half wrong. Ethel Rosenberg was innocent. Julius Rosenberg had done very low-level spying, nothing to do with the atomic bomb, but low-level spying, okay? Why do I tell this story? You're wondering, why am I going back 75 years to the Rosenberg case? Here's why. Nobody will ever doubt, I don't believe, Professor Chomsky's moral judgment or his political acumen. He was in a class all his own, in my opinion, and I think a lot of people would agree with that. And he said to me on a couple of occasions, he said to me, I think they were guilty, and I think they did the right thing. He said, imagine the world after World War II if the US had a monopoly in nuclear weapons. It would have been a catastrophe. We know how the US carries on, even without the monopoly. Now, with that in mind, I think that there are two possibilities. One, as you might know, there are many regions in the world which declared nuclear weapons-free zones. There is the Treaty of Tlatelolco for Latin America. There's the Treaty of Rarotonga for the South Pacific. And there's one for Africa. The local regions decided, we are declaring these nuclear weapon-free zones. No country in this region can get them. There has been a proposal on the table for decades now. Declare the Middle East a nuclear weapons-free zone, like Latin America, South Pacific, Africa. That's an option. Iran has agreed to that option. There's one holdout, one outlier, Israel. So you had the option of turning the Middle East into a nuclear weapon-free zone, and we wouldn't be having any of these discussions.
So let me ask you then, Professor, if Israel was to give up its undeclared nuclear weapons, do you believe Iran would actually give up its goals?
We don't, we're talking about power. We don't have to act on faith. There's no question here of acting on faith. Everybody's now quoting the IAEA, right? They're saying the IAEA said Iran was cheating on some of the aspects of its nuclear weapons program, okay? Well, if you're quoting it, then you must believe the inspections work. You must believe the IAEA is competent to carry out the inspections. So then, what's the problem? It's not an act of faith, an act of trust. Were the inspectors correct about Iraq before 2003 when they said Iraq had no nuclear weapons? There were no weapons of mass destruction. Were the inspectors correct? Well, it turns out they were. So that means the inspections can work and do work, in which case it's not a question of trusting Iran. Speaking of trust, do you have any concept of how Israel acquired its nuclear weapons? Was it by acts of good faith and trust? There's a book by Yaniv Cohen called The Bomb. An Israeli wrote it, okay? And he describes in excruciating detail all the chicanery, all the spying, all the crookedness that Israel engaged in order to acquire the bomb. So it's not as if Israel's record is clean and we can trust it any more than we can trust Iran. I don't believe you can trust any state.
So I'm going to ask you, Professor, what do you think Iran would do with a nuclear weapon if it had one?
I think it would use it as a deterrent because I don't think it's a suicidal state. It knows fully well that if it were ever to use the nuclear weapon, it would be incinerated in the blink of an eye. So it wouldn't use it, but it would be a deterrent.
Why do you think the USA, if I can use the term, tolerates Israel so much if it has gone through the chicanery to get its nuclear weapons, if it often, flouts these international laws? Why is the US so tolerant of it?
Look, that's all. That's like what you call one of these age-old questions, whether it's the dog wagging the tail wagging the dog. I think it's a combination. Obviously, let's take the current situation. Uppermost in President Trump's mind, is the deal with Saudi Arabia. He keeps calling it the deal of the century. Okay? And for the Saudis, it would be a good thing to defang Iran and to neutralize Iran. So it serves a U.S. interest. It serves a U.S. interest broadly, and it serves a Trump interest narrowly. He wants that deal with Iran, with Saudi Arabia. So there is that element, and there is the element of the Israel lobby, in my opinion, that's indisputable. I think it's a combination. It's hard to separate out the extent to which it's U.S. national interests that are operative and the extent to which it's the Israel lobby. If you take the case of Gaza, obviously Israel had its own interest in wanting to solve the Gaza question. But there was a U.S. interest. The U.S. interest was very straightforward. The U.S. relies on Israel to terrify, to keep in place, to subjugate and to subordinate the Middle East. October 7th appeared to reveal a real weakness in the Israeli intelligence, Israeli technological capacity. It revealed a major weakness. And obviously, after October 7th, the thought started running through the heads of many Arabs, hey, maybe Israel isn't as invincible as we thought it was. This ragtag Hamas army maybe they can be defeated, Israel, if Hamas could do it. So there is a thought, it starts to percolate in the Arab world, that maybe there's a military option against Israel after all. And for the United States, that means its main regional surrogate of U.S. power, it has to be restored. Its deterrence capability has to be restored. So the United States was, for its own interest, it was very happy to see Israel annihilate Gaza. So it transmits the message. If you get any idea in your head about a military option against Israel, look at Gaza or what's left of Gaza.
Let me ask you, with so much that's gone on since we spoke about a year ago, to what extent do you think Israel's standing in the world, its reputation, perhaps even with the US, where Donald Trump has said he's very angry with Prime Minister Netanyahu and with Israel in general, how much has that reputation been hurt, both of the country and of course, Prime Minister Netanyahu?
I think that's a difficult question because there's a difference between a temporary and a permanent harm. You're old enough to remember Operation Castlet, 2008-9. That caused huge demonstrations around the world. Huge. And if you remember, Israel was in a very tenuous position after Richard Goldstone, the South African jurist who was Jewish and by his own self-description, a Zionist, had produced this devastating report on what Israel had done in Gaza. You might recall there were fears that Tzipi Livni would be arrested at the British airport under what's called universal jurisdiction. Why do I mention it? Because nobody even remembers Operation Castlet. It's completely forgotten. So whether this current horror will have a permanent impact or it will prove to be a transient impact, I can't say. Remember, for my generation, growing up, for our generation, the defining political experience was the war in Vietnam, right? Now Vietnam is one of the US's main allies in Asia.
You know, it's interesting that there is a speculation that Benjamin Netanyahu wants to continue the conflicts, wants to keep everything on edge and in flux in order to avoid prosecution himself for various things he's been charged with, as well as, of course, to stay in power. How do you regard that kind of perspective?
You know, I'm very skeptical of these arguments for a very simple reason. There's a complete consensus across the Israeli spectrum on wanting to annihilate Gaza and embracing the attack on Iran and Hezbollah, obviously. These attempts to kind of home in on Mr. Netanyahu as if he's the source of the problem, I just think that's completely wrong-headed. Every few years you hear these predictions. Netanyahu's term is over. It's over. I mean, you can probably fill a book now with these predictions, okay? But that's not what happened. Netanyahu is the mirror, is the embodiment, the incarnation of Israel society.
The whole of society?
He's an obnoxious, self-righteous Jewish supremacist. An obnoxious, self-righteous Jewish supremacist. When Israelis see Mr. Netanyahu, they see themselves. That's why he keeps winning the elections. So,
but sorry, what about the protests against him?
The protests against him have to do with things like separation of church and state in Israel, preserving the alleged independence of the judiciary, the policy on the hostages, But that's not what we're talking about. I said regarding Gaza and Iran. And there's a broad consensus. If you look at the polls, just take Israelis are probably the most polled people on earth. Every morning we have to know what Israelis think. It's so important to the future of humanity to know every morning whether an Israeli had one egg or two eggs, whether it was a boiled egg or an omelet. Everything about Israelis are polled because they're so important. So what did the polls show? The polls show for 20 months among Israeli Jews, 95% believed that Israel was using too little force or enough force in Gaza. About 5% thought Israel was using too much force. Okay? A poll about a month ago showed that one half of Israelis, 47%, one half of Israeli Jews believed that Israel should commit a genocide in Gaza. There is no ambiguity about the question. We don't have to go to a dictionary and parse the definition of genocide. The question that was put to Israeli Jews was, do you believe that when the IDF conquers a city, it should kill everybody in the city? That was the question. Do you believe that if the IDF conquers a city, it should kill everybody in the city? 47% of Israeli Jews answered yes to that question. Another poll about 2 to 3 weeks ago, it asked the question, do you believe there are any innocents, civilians in Gaza, civilian innocents in Gaza? The poll was taken of all Israelis, including Arab Israelis. 63% said no, there are no innocents in Gaza. If you eliminate the Arab component, it's about 70% say there are no innocents in Gaza, which means the army can kill everyone. So, have you read any significant dissent in the Israeli ruling elite on the policy of annihilating Gaza? Has any single Israeli sitting in office or out of office or the opposition, has anyone said, no, I think it's morally wrong to annihilate Gaza? Nobody says that.
Do you think
Does anyone say, no, I don't think it was right to break international law and attack Iran? Did anyone say that? Now, as a senior intelligence official in the Obama administration, the most senior, he said that the attack on Hezbollah, the walkie-talkie attack, he described it as pure terrorism. That's what he said, it was pure terrorism. Did anyone in the Israeli ruling elite say, oh, that was terrible, that was pure terrorism?
Do you believe, though, Israelis see the pictures of the conditions in Gaza, the starving children, the degree to which the place has been completely flattened? I mean,
I think these questions, I appreciate the questions, but they represent, not by you, but the questions themselves represent a high level of what, let's call it, naivete. First of all, the opposition leader in Israel said, quote, our IDF kill children as a hobby. He was the head of the opposition, Golan. He said, everybody knows that. Remember, Israel has a citizen army. A citizen army in principle is a good thing. It means everybody should have to bear the burden of putting their life on the line to defend the country's independence and so forth. That's in principle correct. In our country, only poor people do that. We don't have a conscript army. So it's a good thing, I think, that everybody should have to bear the burden of sacrificing his or her life to defend the country. But there's an underside. The underside is If you have an army that's representative of the whole population, okay, it's a citizen army, and that army is committing genocide, that means a representative sample of Israeli society is committing genocide. How could they not know? Israel's a small country. It's very tribalistic. They all come together in moments of crisis, right? You're telling me that all these Israeli soldiers are posting on the web what they're doing in Gaza. They're posting it. If you're posting it, it must mean you don't fear being ostracized. You don't boast about it, that you're annihilating cities. You don't boast about it if you feared ostracism. You're telling me when the conscripts come home, they don't tell anybody what was going on in Gaza? Israel per capita has the highest usage of the web on our planet of any country in the world. They didn't see those starving images. They don't see the kids huddled with the pots begging for food. They don't see it. Is that plausible? Is that believable? Is that credible? Of course they know. Of course they know. When doctors report that children are being systematically shot in the head and in the chest, foreign doctors report that. The Israelis don't know? No.
Considering how openly, as you say, these genocidal kind of goals or tendencies are expressed, is there any chance that Israel and Benjamin Netanyahu will appear in the International Court of Justice in the ICC?
The International Criminal Court has indicted Israel on charges of not genocide, but various war crimes, in particular using starvation as a weapon of war. Whether they will be prosecuted, I would say the answer is, the likelihood is zero. It took Karim Khan long enough to file the charges, and I can't see, and the ICC is not a court. The ICC is simply International Criminal Court is simply a contrivance of the West to prosecute and keep in line non-Western countries. For a long time, the ICC was called the International Caucasian Court because all the prosecutors were Africans, African leaders. It got a little bit embarrassing under Luis Ocampo, and so they then got Fatou Bensouda, an African woman, to do the dirty work. She was a total crook. And
I have to say, these are your opinions, just to make sure.
well, I've written a book about it, and I've now written the second book about it. The first book was called I Accuse, about Fatou Bensouda. And now I'm coming out with a new book in a couple of months entitled Gaza's Grave Diggers, an inquiry into corruption in high places. And I go through the record of Bensouda and several others. So the ICC, a very distinguished international lawyer whose name I can't reveal because it'll cause him grief, he said it's not a court. It's simply a contrivance of the West to keep the other people, non-Westerners, in line. The ICJ is a different story. The International Court of Justice. Now, as you know, in January 2024, January 26th, they found that Israel was plausibly committing genocide in Gaza. But those were preliminary hearings. I don't want to go through the technicalities. The case hasn't actually been heard. The full case hasn't actually been heard. I think there's a reasonable possibility. It all really depends on the composition of the court, because it's a nation-state-based court. Who's going to be the president? Who's going to be on the court? Right now, they have a complete crook as the vice president of the court, Julia Sabatindi from Uganda. In my forthcoming book, I have a 100-page chapter on her. She's a complete and total crook. they're afraid, everybody knows it, but people are afraid to say it because she's the first African woman on the court. So, because of wokeness, you're not allowed to call a woman a crook, let alone a woman of color a crook. Well, guess what? She's a woman. She's a woman of color, and she's a colossal crook. Julia Sabatindi, she's currently the vice president of the International Court of Justice. And there are a couple of fellows like Mr. Tomka, Judge Tomka from Slovakia, Judge Orescu from Romania, who you might call minor league crooks. But there is a phalanx of people on the court who, A, believe there's plausible evidence of genocide, but B is important. In January, then in March, and then in May, the court issued what's called the indicated provisional measures. And that's just a fancy term for, we told Israel, there's evidence that you're committing genocide. So you have to do A, B, C, and D to prevent the genocide. Okay, you have to allow in humanitarian aid. You have to tell your army to stop carrying on in this way. Israel ignored all the provisional measures, and that has to grate on the court. They can't like the fact that this august body, the supreme legal body in the world, the International Court of Justice, 3 times, January, March, and May, indicated provisional measures, and Israel ignored them. So I think there is a reasonable prospect that they will find Israel guilty of breaching the 1948 Genocide Convention.
If it is headed up or at least populated with these members that you consider to be crooks, where does that leave the prospect of getting true international justice? Where does that leave the world in terms of having a body on?
As I said, in the International Criminal Court, lost cause. Karim Khan is pitiful. I think that's pretty obvious. The current
He put his neck out, though.
For the sake of the audience, I don't want them to get confused. Karim Khan is the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. He put his neck out because it was becoming absurd that they reacted in a blink of an eye after Russia went into Ukraine. The ICJ, the International Court of Justice, had found that Israel is plausibly committing genocide, and the International Criminal Court wasn't doing anything. So it was losing all of its credibility. And so the pressure builds inside there are in the ICC, because I've studied it, there are a lot of decent people working within the administrative side of the court. There are a lot of decent people. So there's the pressure on the inside, and then there's the pressure being exerted from the outside on the court. So, yes, he finally did something. As you know, no point in, I don't want to get into the trivial aspects, but it was unclear the timing of his decision to issue the arrest warrants because he had the sexual harassment charges weighing on him. And there's a lot of speculation. I've talked to people in the court who said, yes, the timing probably was due to the sexual harassment charges weighing on him. However, that doesn't change the fact that there was already a very formidable case that Israel was carrying out crimes of a significant magnitude in Gaza.
I want to get your take on something that has been put out there too. South Africa is considered pretty brave for having taken on Israel by going to the ICJ with the genocide case. There are those who believe that South Africa is now a target for the USA, and that
Oh
this whole white
yeah,
farmers issue was a way to kind of punish South Africa, the
I think
treatment of
that's
Cyril
true.
Ramaphosa. What's your view on that?
Yeah, first of all, if I were in the South African delegation, I would be terrified if there was even one skeleton in my closet. Those folks, beginning with the senior member, John Dugard. I know Professor Dugard, a really impressive guy. He's 89 years old, and he was kind of like, had an uneasy gait as he came up to the podium. Uh, I don't want to sing his praises because it might sound sycophantic, and that's not my nature. But he was the lawyer for the Nelson Mandela family when Mandela was in jail. He was Bishop Tutu's lawyer, and he's a white South African. I should have clarified that. He's a white South African. And the Israelis have always had him in their crosshairs because he was the UN Special Rapporteur for the occupied territories. And if you read his reports, they were really meticulous. They were very impressive. So I'm thinking to myself, that guy must have been a saint, must have been a saint in his life, because otherwise the Israelis would have destroyed him. And it's a large delegation, as you remember. I think it's about 7 people. So far there have been no cracks. So
Well,
far.
I spoke with the former South African ambassador to the US, Ibrahim Rasool, while I was in South Africa recently, and he said, the idea was that South Africa feels the obligation, having been through apartheid, having seen extremes when it comes to situations for oppressed people, to stand up and support the idea of true diplomacy and speak out. Of course, he was expelled as a result from South Africa. So it seems at least there is maybe the starting of a movement that might question the world order in that way.
It's a step, but it's a long look. Mao Zedong once said, former head of the Chinese Communist Party. So in the history of the Chinese Revolution, there's the famous story of the Long March, which I think was 6,000 miles, when the Chinese communists were being encircled by the nationalist forces. And Mao Zedong famously said to traverse, I think it's 8,000 li, L-I, if my memory is right. To traverse 8,000 li, you have to take the first step. And so South Africa took, in my forthcoming book, I devote a large portion of the introduction to honoring the South African delegation. I sent it to Professor Dugard, and he thought I was over the top. But really, it was a riveting moment. I was sitting in front of my computer screen watching it. I showed it to my class because I was teaching a course in the laws of war. It was a riveting moment when the South Africa, it wasn't just a court case, because the South African delegation, it really was a rainbow delegation. It was old white men like John Dugard and Professor Lowe. I think he's from Oxford. It was African men, South African men, a South African Indian woman, and then there were South African white men. But it was a beautiful projection of the future. So it's a first step, just like the victory of Zoran Mamdani.
I'm going to ask you about that in a moment, but let me get back to some of the things that are happening now currently. Donald Trump has said he doesn't want regime change in Iran now because he doesn't want to see everything turning to chaos. I guess regime change in the region, many people have a lens on that from the past with everything from attempts with Syria, Iraq, and so on. Regime change hasn't got a good record in the Middle East, has it?
It's hard for me to assess that. First of all, I hate euphemisms. It's not regime change. You're overthrowing a government. Let's be honest. Regime change sounds so sanitary. You're engaged in the illegal, the most gross breach of the UN Charter when you carry on in this way, and we should be honest about it. It takes Kofi Annan. It took him a very long time. I think he was out of office already. Kofi Annan, again for the listeners, because time flies, he was the Secretary General of the UN during the U.S. invasion of Iraq. And he finally came out, I think when he was already retired, and said it was an illegal war. He wouldn't say while it was actually going on.
Well,
Just like,
difficult for him to do so
yeah,
while he was there.
well,
Yeah.
If it's difficult for you to do so, Mahatma Gandhi famously said, the most powerful word in the English language is no. You could have just stepped down. If you stay silent, nobody is putting a gun to Mr. Kofi Annan's head. Nobody was putting a gun to the IAEA head when he stayed silent that there was no evidence that Iran was engaged in a program to build nuclear weapons. So I don't accept it was hard. You always have the option to step down and not do dirty work by your silence. You have the option. In any event, I don't like this sanitary language like regime change. You are in grotesque, brazen, outrageous breach of the UN Charter. And we should just say that out loud. It's not regime change. It's overthrowing a government. Its record, I think, do many people care that Libya was destroyed as a country? Do many people care that Syria was destroyed as a country? Do many people, people in power, do they really care that Iraq was destroyed as a country? I don't think they give a darn.
One quirky little thing, Professor, is that there's been discussion of the Nobel Peace Prize. Now, of course, Barack Obama was granted the Nobel Peace Prize quite controversially in some circles in 2009 when he became president.
It's just the wokeness.
Yeah, well, I was wondering
Everyone wants to show how woke they are, and he's the grand beneficiary of wokeness.
What about Donald Trump, though? It seems he might have his eyes set on it. If he was to solve the situation, say between Iran and Israel, or say between the Palestinians and Israel, does he deserve a Nobel Peace Prize?
Look, Henry Kissinger got a Nobel Peace Prize. Probably one of the, he's got to be up there in the top 5 mass murderers of the 20th century. Menachem Begin got a Nobel Peace Prize, a mass murderer. And you can go down the list. I've already forgotten. So
I should point out, you always give your opinion. Your opinion is pretty strong.
Well, if you ever read, for example, there's a very large volume by Seymour Hersh. It's called The Price of Power, Henry Kissinger and the Nixon White House. And it's about 800 pages. And I think it's accurate to describe in about each page, another 1,000 people are dead because of Kissinger. It's not fashionable anymore to say it. Professor Chomsky used to call Henry Kissinger in the 60s the doctor of death. 4 million people were killed in Southeast Asia by the United States. That's not a small number. 2 million Vietnamese. But that was a horror. That was the defining experience of an entire generation.
So the Nobel Peace Prize has no real value in your eyes?
It seems to be pretty good at pinpointing who are the main mass murderers of each generation. So I don't attach any significance to it.
Is the world bowing down to Donald Trump? It seems, he was at NATO, and the NATO Secretary General, the Dutch head of NATO, current head of NATO, referred to him as daddy, coming into solve two arguing, two fighting siblings, perhaps with Iran and Israel. The references to him as daddy, and the kind of nature and the way people are very keen to keep him happy, to assuage his concerns. Is he? I mean, is the world bowing to Donald Trump?
Look, he's an erratic figure. He's an eccentric figure. It's very difficult to. Uh, he's a narcissist, and so everything is everything is contingent on his ego.
But with him not being a politician, some say he might actually achieve the things that the old guard might not.
I just think this is kind of ridiculous. He there were there were obvious ways to resolve, for example, the Israel-Palestine dispute. The U.S. stood in the way. The U.S. blocked it. The U.S. went along with Israel's opposition to an independent Palestinian state. I'm talking now, the goal of an independent Palestinian state dates back, believe it or not, to the early 70s. The PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, had already agreed to it. There was a solution on the table for already a half century.
That's what
The
I'm saying. It's
U.S.
historic, and perhaps someone who's not historically a politician might have some sway in it. You don't think?
Uh,
If he's a maverick they're scared of, maybe they'll have to step down and listen a little bit. I'm throwing it out there. You don't see it.
no, because Mr. Trump is not going to tell Israel to end its settlements. It's not going to tell Israel to give up control of East Jerusalem. The Palestinians might be forced to accept a rump state. That's possible. But a state that has any substance, no, I think that's good. But that's true of every administration. It was never going to happen. And I think people are hyper. Look, Trump is a menace. I'm not going to deny that. Trump is a menace. But let's remember the facts. Who presided over the genocide in Gaza? Was it Donald Trump? Where was 90% of the death and 90% of the destruction? Did that occur under Donald Trump? The assaults on academic freedom in our country, the crushing of the encampments, the threatened deportations at the time, did that occur under Donald Trump? When 3 presidents of Ivy League universities were toppled, ousted, because they were insufficiently repressive of the encampments. Did that occur under Donald Trump? When Claudine Gay was removed from Harvard, when McGill was removed from the University of Pennsylvania, when Shafiq was removed from Columbia, did that occur under Donald Trump? This idea that somehow he represents a new phenomenon. Yeah, there are elements of him. You can imagine Barack Obama. He used to read the morning briefings. The intelligence community gave the morning briefings. Okay, you can imagine Biden. He didn't read them because he didn't have the mental competence. But you would imagine that Tony Blinken, read them. In the Trump administration, Rubio reading them? No. Trump reading them? Forget it. So yes, there is, let's just call it an information gap separating Obama. I said Obama, but remember, Obama just read the briefings. Now, just as a factual matter, a historical footnote, Jimmy Carter, was breathtaking in his mastery of the facts in any situation where he commented. If you look at the record of Carter preparing for what was the original Camp David in 1977 with Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin, his mastery of detail was breathtaking.
It's ironic he's not remembered as a good president by many Americans, isn't it?
Yeah, he actually was the most competent of the modern presidents. Him and Lyndon Johnson. Clinton was a voracious reader. He wasn't as disciplined as Carter, but he knew public policy. He had the concentration. Obama, he read the daily briefings. Obama was never interested in politics. It was just pure narcissism. That's why Obama and Trump don't get along. It's what Freud called the narcissism of small differences. They're mirror images of each other. They're both just stupendous narcissists, Obama and Trump. But Obama read the daily briefing. Trump, nothing. But there is a question. Do you prefer in that Oval Office somebody who's hyper competent or hyper incompetent? I'm not sure which I prefer. I'm sure Tony Blinken was very efficient, very competent, very knowledgeable. And you know what? He was a moral monster. So do I prefer a Trump to a Blinken? Or a Blinken to a Trump? I don't know. I don't know if I want somebody hyper competent or incompetent office. But you say it's true. Trump is so erratic that you can't really predict what he'll do. It's true.
Even he says he doesn't know what he's going to do.
Yeah, that was a very funny remark.
Will the academic world recover, Professor, from the hit it's taken that you described? It's come so heavily under attack. I think it's largely unprecedented, it seems. Do you see it recovering? And what does this do for the students who look for some kind of guidance and leadership through the educational institutes?
Well, right now there is a reign of terror in the U.S. institutions of higher education, universities and colleges. There's a reign of terror. I've been reading the Harvard reports on anti-Semitism at Harvard. It's completely bogus.
Well, we talked about it before last time about the weaponization of the term.
Yeah, but if you look, the report is interminable. I'll tell you a funny story. I read the report once. I have it sitting right over there. I read the report once about a month and a half ago. And now I'll be speaking in New York with two people who I respect very much on July 17th, I think. And I have to reread the report. So I sit down, and it's very hot in my apartment because I don't have air conditioning. It was 100 degrees yesterday. Wow. And the day before. So I'm reading the report, and the way I had organized the pages, it's not worth going into. So I'm on page 131, 132, 133, 154, and then I didn't realize I was reading it again. I had just read it the day before, but I was reading 131 again, 132. I had just read it the day before. It's so boring. It's this navel gazing.
What's the ultimate goal?
On a cosmic, every thought that a Jewish student at Harvard, every thought has to be recorded for eternity. I really don't care. Okay, you're smart. I get that. You're in Harvard. You're probably very smart. I'm not going to take it away. But you know what? You're 20 years old. I really don't give a flying fig what you have to say about anything. I really don't. I know there were some people who were very smart at 20. Okay, I'll grant that. I grant Bach. I listened to his music even when he was at 6 years old. Mozart when he was 20. Okay, I'll grant that. But I really don't care about every single thought about how our Harvard students feels afraid here and uncomfortable here. Guess what? 90% of humanity feels afraid and uncomfortable every minute of every day of their lives. They feel hungry. They often don't have roofs over their heads. So if somebody said something at Harvard College that made you feel afraid, unwelcome, these are the words they use. We felt unwelcome, uncomfortable. We felt afraid. You know what? I don't really care.
What is the goal of all these attacks, though?
The goal is very simple. The goal is to silence any criticism of Israel. It was perfectly obvious what the goal was. Bill Ackman, who is a Harvard alumnus, he's married to an Israeli pilot from the Israeli Air Force. She's a trophy wife. If you juxtapose the two in a picture, it's not difficult to figure out what's going on. So I'm sure his wife, let's, I don't like euphemisms, but you get the idea. She implored him and made her love conditional on him turning the screws on Harvard. So he had contributed $50 million to Harvard. He's a hedge fund manager, a billionaire, Bill Ackman. There was one person who had contributed $200 million to Harvard. Another person had contributed $300 million to Harvard. That's money. No, it's true. Harvard has an endowment of $60 billion, but it's still money. And then all the Jewish alumni put together a petition. At the last, it was a long time ago now, it was about 1,200 names. Now I'm sure it's much longer, threatening to withhold alumni contributions. So it was taking Harvard hostage. It was extortion. Either you crush the encampments or you're not getting alumni money. You're not getting alumni contributions. And then it's true, again, Trump is a menace. It's true. So when he came into office, he expanded the target. Originally, the target was the encampments, the Middle East studies programs, Harvard. There were sympathetic voices at Harvard Medical School, Harvard Divinity School, and the Harvard School of Public Health. And they came under concerted attack now because of the threats of withholding alumni money. When Trump comes in, he broadens the target to all of these woke courses, in sexuality, ethnic studies, women's studies. He broadened the target because, first of all, a lot of those courses, they are garbage. You have to be honest about those things. Those courses are unserious. They're just woke courses with social justice warriors carrying on like little Stalins and threatening everybody with being canceled if you don't toe the party line. So President Trump had an easy target because a lot of those courses didn't belong in a curriculum. A lot of the reading lists were ridiculous. He took advantage of it. But it didn't begin under him. And right now, it is, I would say, Uh, I think everybody is walking on eggshells.
But do you see any kind of backlash against the right rising? We've seen Zohran Mamdani just won the New York City Democratic primary on a socialist platform. He could become the city's first Muslim mayor. How much of a turning point is that? And what does it indicate of where things might go?
Well, I want to just, I belatedly, because I was caught up in Gaza and then I was caught up with Iran more recently. So I only belatedly got active in Mamdani's campaign. I was out there all of the week preceding. I went out every day knocking on doors and
So you're
talking to
encouraged.
me.
You're encouraged.
First of all, I want to just correct you on one point. Not correct you, I want to amend what you said. Nobody, I don't think one volunteer, he had 50,000 volunteers by the end. It was 36,000, but then I started hearing a figure 50,000. Let's go 36,000 because I know that's accurate. He had at least 36,000 volunteers who knocked, the estimate is, on 1.5 million doors. It was a huge campaign. You know, for you guys in the room, to try to count to the number 1 million, if you start now and try to, it'll take you 3 weeks. Knocking on 1.5 million doors, it's a lot. You know, let's say in a building like mine, because I did it, you have to wait for somebody to let you in the building before you could start knocking on doors. You know, you could do in 3 hours, you know how many doors you can get? I'm serious, about 20. So to have knocked on 1.5 million doors, it's quite a feat. But I wanted to say, I met the volunteers. I met them. They were a very narrow age cohort, about 25. I actually saw very few people who were even 30. I mean, between my age and the next person, you could fit the Himalayan mountains. There was
So taking that,
okay.
yeah.
So I don't believe one person. I'm going to tell you this. I don't think one person volunteered for him because he was Muslim.
Yeah, I
So
mentioned that.
I know
Because
everybody's casting it because they're all into these identity politics. They didn't vote for him. They didn't support him because he was a Muslim, because he presented a radical program to transform our city. Nobody cared that he was Muslim. So every time I hear these people, democracy now, first Muslim president, New York Times, first Muslim
I
president.
think I think it's because of the general Islamophobia that's been built up over
No,
the
I think
past.
it's because of identity politics. They look at it through the. It was a class program. This was a clear cut class struggle. 30, the ruling, the billionaire class, the Ackmans, who I mentioned, the Bloomberg gave $8.3 million. The real estate industry, he was outspent, Mamdani, 30-1. It was 30 million. They say 25, but then there were these hidden PACs, super PACs. It was about 30 million versus Mamdani raised 1.2 million. You know, it was the Bernie Sanders candidacy, but on a local level. Bernie Sanders, every night he hammered away the billionaire class, big pharma, Goldman Sachs. And this was on a local level. But as one person put it, a big donor, the real estate, Reckler is his name. He said, what's going on here? New York City is the capital, the world capital of capitalism. The world capital of capitalism. We're not letting Mamdani, a socialist, we're not letting him in City Hall. This was a class struggle. It had nothing to do with his identity.
Fine.
If he had been white and he was clever as Mamdani is, it would have been a white candidate, Jewish, anything.
So having established that, let me get back to my first point or the question: what does this bode for the future?
Well, it's the first step in a long march. It's going to become brutal now, between now and November. It's, to my thinking, it's pretty obvious what they're going to do. They want to knock out they want one candidate. They want to coalesce under around one candidate. So then, right now, you have Curtis Sliwa in the Republican Party. You have Eric Adams, the current mayor, a crook of a very high order. You have possibility of Cuomo running. And if you have those three, it'll split the opposition vote. So they're going to get rid of Sliwa, give him a few bucks, a total prostitute Sliwa. Get rid of Adams, probably give him, a few free trips to the Caribbean. And then, or they may get rid of, or Cuomo may decide from pride he's not going to do it, in which case they're already talking about a coalescing around Adams. So it'll be down to two. The vote against Mamdani won't be split. It'll be down to two. And then it will be full blast the smear campaign. It will be full blast the smear campaign. The biggest error that Mamdani could commit, he's a very smart guy. He doesn't need my advice, but I'm going to offer it. Don't do what Corbyn did. When he started getting smeared with the anti-Semitism charges, first by the British Board of... Jeremy Corbyn, excuse me. First by the British Board of Deputies, and then by the whole ruling elite, from Sky News to the BBC, from The Guardian to the tabloids. They used and Corbyn kept trying to appease them and placate them, making one concession after another. That's never going to work. You will never placate them, even if you get on your hands and knees. And beg. It's not going to happen. So my strong advice to Mr. Mamdani is don't try to appease. On his election night victory speech, he said, I know that there are a lot of people who feel uncomfortable with certain of my views. He said, and we know who he was alluding to. And he said, I will stick by my principles. I will stick by my convictions. But he said, I'm ready to listen to the concerns of the other side. I, of course, like the first part, I worried about the second part.
The concession.
Yes, yeah, because I'm for listening. Of course, you should always listen. But is that opening a door? If he opens the door, A, he can never appease them, and B, his base will disintegrate because they'll see another guy selling out.
We're going to have to watch that race, obviously, very closely, especially with your prediction. As we kind of wrap this up, and I have to say, Professor, I'm old school, so in the interest of journalistic sanctity, I have to point out your views, your very strong views on people that you've mentioned are your views,
Okay.
Which is fair
enough. Is there anybody in this room who believes that a large number of politicians and people in power are crooks? Well, is there anyone who doesn't believe it? Raise your hand.
Like I say,
I don't see any hands raised.
Look, I'm old school, so I have to always. My opinions don't come into this, so I really am very clear about letting you speak. But I do point out that these are your views and they're very strong, and it makes me wonder: how have you been allowed to speak out in such a cutting way for so long?
Well, easy. Nobody listens.
Or maybe everyone listens, but no one seems to challenge you to the degree that, I mean, why has there not been a stronger kind of, and I'm just asking your opinion, campaign against you for speaking out to Israel? Most people who, might be in your position. Mr. Khan. Please, Riz.
Riz, brace yourself. I never had a job. I I never could find employment. I did what you call, in the United States, it's called adjuncting. It's part-time work. You know how much I earned most of my life on a yearly basis living in New York, except for a temporary period in Chicago for 6 years. It was between $15,000 and $25,000 a year. That's correct.
That's
You
tough.
know, I never had a job. I'm just speaking factually. My life is over. You know, the long
Certainly not in the terms
the
of
long
your
arc.
visibility.
I didn't, quote unquote, I didn't get away with it. I paid a price. I was willing to pay that price, and uh, I have no regrets about it. Of course, I can be self-pitying. And I can be bitter, which I have been. Not anymore, because it's over. Um, but I never had a job. Now, just to give you a few trivial examples, okay? I wrote the only book, Political History of Gaza. I wrote the only one, Gaza: An Inquest into Its Martyrdom. The only one, the only scholarly book on the subject. There is, in respect, Sarah Roy of Harvard, she wrote the major economic study of Gaza. The only scholarly uh, political history of Gaza was written by me. It came out from University of California Press. It's a distinguished publishing house, okay, academic publishing house. It's never been mentioned anywhere. I don't, even in like the radical chic places like London Review of Books, or the cool woke places like the New Yorker magazine, you will not, if you do a search, you will not find one mention of that book anywhere. And you know what? I'm going to toot my own horn. It's a damn good book. Professor Chomsky said, in terms of its range, its sweep, its depth, its analysis, he said it's in a class all its own.
Perhaps the way things have been going in recent history, people will pay a lot more attention because it's going to be a time everyone's wondering that how it will be remembered in history. We shall
Well,
see.
guess what? That happened October 7th. Gaza was everywhere for 20 months. The book was never mentioned. Never. It received two reviews, one in the Journal of Palestine Studies and another in this tiny little periodical called something like Middle East Affairs. Nothing. Now, it is true, because of my knowledge of the subject and the miracle of the social media, I have a real media presence now. If I walk on the subway, walk down the street, large numbers of people recognize me. Have I been on one national television program, national radio program? Have I been on one in the United States? One? No, not one. In the UK, I was on that program called Morning Joe. I was on that program once, and the other case was Piers Morgan.
Right.
Now, Piers Morgan had me on about 8 times, I think, something like that. I'm not going to speculate on why he broke the taboo, but I will say he doesn't challenge me. I've noticed that he will never say to me, "You're wrong," because he knows I'm right. He can, he won't, factually, I mean, he won't agree with my interpretation of the data. Let's say if I say it's not a war, it's a genocide, he'll say, he said for about 15 months that the Israeli attack was disproportionate. That was the term. It wasn't disproportionate. It was not. It was proportionate. It was proportionate to its goal. its goal was to solve the Gaza question. You have to understand what its goal was.
Mm-hmm.
If its goal was to defeat Hamas, then you could say it was disproportionate. But if its goal was to commit a genocide in Gaza, it was proportionate to its goal. So we could disagree on those points, but I have to say, he was unusual because that's the only national program. But it's the miracle of the web. You take a interview by me with him, then they chop it up into 10,000 pieces and they make it on TikTok. So it looks like, oh, people call me up. You must be so busy. So many people must be calling you. I say, as a matter of fact, nobody's called me.
Well, I'm glad we did.
I told Piers Morgan, or the person who works for him, I said, actually, I have a lot to say in Iran. And I know a lot because I taught the Non-Proliferation Treaty. I've studied it. I've studied the International Court of Justice ruling on nuclear weapons. I'm not busy at all. Nobody asked me, including him. Nobody asked me to be on. I think it's an optical illusion, what you're referring to. I paid by conventional standards. Nelson Mandela spent 28 years in jail. Martin Luther King was killed at age 39. Malcolm X was killed at age 39. And you can go through the list, okay? So I did not experience a martyrdom. And I will not lose sight of that fact. I have a roof over my head. I have food in my refrigerator. I don't fear usually for my life. So I didn't pay that price. But I said by conventional standards, I paid a large price. I have a PhD. I'm not trying to toot my horn. I'm just speaking objectively. I have a PhD from Princeton University. I was never able to get a job. I don't mean at a major university. I don't even mean at a middle-level university. I applied to universities in the backwoods of the South because actually I thought it would be nice to teach there. The good side of the web I talked about already. The bad side of the web is they don't look for references anymore. No schools ask for references. They just Google your name. And so you Google my name, you'll have 30,000 websites saying I'm a Holocaust denier. You'll have 30,000 websites saying I'm a supporter of terrorism. And it's over. It's over. Even if they were willing to go through each of these websites to see whether it's true. Does anybody want to have the burden of me in the faculty? No. So I did pay a price by conventional standards. And B, if it looks like I'm omnipresent, and if I have high facial recognition now, it's a kind of an optical illusion. It's 2 or 3 interviews which have been chopped up into 10,000 pieces, and they're all over the web. Just to give you an example, so I was on with Lex Friedman, and I debated Professor Benny Morris from Israel, and this thing called Destiny, right? So with Destiny, it came out mostly to name calling because he's a moron. I can't fix that. I can't repair that fact. It's in his DNA. So that debate lasted about 3 hours. It was 3 hours, 3 or 5. I can't remember now. It was 3 or 5. In any event, there are 10,000 videos now out there of me calling Destiny a moron. And each video, each one, has 1 million hits. Everybody, I saw you with Destiny. That was so funny. That was so funny. So it gave me a name. Like the other famous one was in Waterloo, Canada. It was like something like 2003, where this woman is crying about, I make them feel so bad when I say that Israelis are carrying on like Nazis. And I said, please stop with the crocodile tears. Okay? So whenever I'm in any Arab country, I can be walking down the streets of Amman, Jordan, all right? 10,000 people rush up to me. Crocodile tears! Crocodile tears! You know? I think to myself, I spent my whole life immersed in books, steeped in reports, trying to get all these factual details right. And the only thing people remember of me, the only thing I'll be remembered for is crocodile tears.
Well, Professor, thank you for being so generous with your time today. And it won't be 10,000 pieces, I hope, not that many at least, but it was great to have a chance to see you face to face and to speak with you again. I look forward to next time. Thank you, sir. Well, certainly no punches held back, as ever, from Professor Norman Finkelstein. That's it for this edition of the show. Thanks for watching. Please send your comments and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.